Well, good afternoon and welcome to our October lunchtime dial-in, where we look forward to sharing with you the latest updates on the issues and developments affecting churches and Christian charities at this time. My name is Jackie Fletcher and I'm Head of Treasurer Services here at Stewardship. I'm joined today by three of our resident experts, Stephen Matthews, one of our senior consultants, Kevin Russell, who is our Technical and Advocacy Director, and Archie McDowell, who is our Acting Head of Accounts Examination. So here at Stewardship, our vision is for the world to encounter Jesus through the generosity of his church, and the purpose of today's dial-in is to strengthen Christian causes. If you'd like to find out more about how we could support your church or charity, you can check out all of our services and resources on our website, or do feel free to call our church and charity team and chat to one of our advisors. The number's on your screen now, and it will also be sent out in the follow-up email after the call. If you'd like to make sure you receive the follow-up materials, including the podcast recording, you'll need to ensure that you're signed up to the dial-in mailing list. And if you haven't yet done that, please email us to find out how, and one of the team can send you the link. So moving on quickly today, we have a lot to cover. Today's agenda includes a charity law roundup on the remuneration of charity trustees. We've got a section called Be Alert on charity fraud, another charity law roundup, this time on fundraising appeals. That will be followed by a slot on the cost of living and how the church can respond. And finally, another charity law roundup, this time on Exgratia payments. It's quite packed today, so we will have our normal Q&A session at the end. But if we don't have as much time as usual, we may just stick first to questions on these subjects that are being covered today. So if you do have questions, just use the chat function to ask them. We'll answer as many as we can in the time that we have together. If you haven't joined us before, the instructions are on the screen now. A quick prayer before we start. Lord, would you be with us in this call today? Bless those in attendance and the organisations that they serve. And may what we share in the presentations and during the Q&A be really helpful in enabling each of us to serve you well in our respective ministries. In Jesus' name, amen. Let's make a start on our first item. Kevin is here to bring us the first part of his charity law roundup.
Good afternoon. And this is the first of a series bringing you more detail on changes being brought about by Charities Act 2022. And as per the agenda, the presentation's in three separate parts, and we'll have further sessions over the coming 12 months on more parts of the Act as they are brought into force. So today we cover the changes that are expected to come into force in the next month or two: remuneration of charity trustees, fundraising appeals, and Exgratia payments. And I'll comment further on Exgratia payments in a moment, as there have been some developments literally in the last few days. And we'll be updating relevant briefing papers on these topics, which we'll send you shortly. There's a couple of more niche changes there on the slide that I won't be covering today. So starting with remuneration of charity trustees. The basic position is that charity trustees are not permitted to make any gain from their position as trustees. And this extends to persons closely connected with the trustee, such as close family, business partners, and the like. So ordinarily, trustees are not permitted to be paid for being a trustee, for being an employee of their charity, for supplying goods or services from their own business, or indeed to receive any other kind of benefit. That said, there are several perfectly legal routes by which a trustee can receive some benefit from their charity. And briefly, these are where the charity's governing document permits it, there are suitable safeguards built in, and the Charity Commission has agreed to it. Secondly, by an order of the court or the Charity Commission. And thirdly, where there's a statutory power to pay a trustee. And it's this last one, the statutory power, that is changing. Before Charities Act 2022, this power only applied to services provided by trustees, and where certain conditions are met, these being that there's a written agreement for the provision of the services, the remuneration is reasonable, payment is in the best interests of the charity, the number of trustees that benefit are a minority of the total, and that there is no prohibition on trustee remuneration in the governing document. And none of that changes. What Charities Act 2022 does do is to extend the statutory power to the provision of goods and to goods and services provided by a trustee. So before now, a builder who's a trustee could provide labour, but couldn't be remunerated for the supply of building materials that go alongside that labour. The 2022 Act corrects that somewhat absurd outcome. The second change is that the statutory power could, until now, only be used if there was no other power available to the charity. So if a remuneration power existed in the governing document, even if that power was more restrictive, it would prevent the use of the statutory power. But now, so long as the proposed payment is not expressly prohibited by the charity's governing document, the statutory power acts in addition to any enabling power in the governing document. But do note that the statutory power still does not permit a trustee to be paid for services as a trustee or as an employee of the charity. The third and final change now empowers the Charity Commission rather than just the court to order a charity to remunerate a trustee or to authorise a trustee to retain a benefit already received, where it would be, in the view of the Commission, inequitable not to do so. So that's all for the moment on the Charities Act. I'll be back with you in a little while to talk about fundraising appeals and restricted funds. In the meantime, back to you, Jackie.
Thank you, Kevin. And as Kevin mentioned, we're in the process of updating some of our briefing papers to reflect these changes following the Charities Act 2022. So we'll email you a link to all of these in a few weeks as soon as they're ready. So next up, by happy coincidence, we've booked our dial-in during Charity Fraud Awareness Week, and Archie is here with some helpful pointers on how we can keep our charities safe from fraudsters. Archie.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Jackie. And as Jackie mentioned, this week is Charity Fraud Awareness Week. This is a national initiative by the Charity Commission and other bodies to raise awareness of the sadly all too frequent instances of fraud, which many charities and churches now fall victim to. Unfortunately, not only is the number of incidences of fraud steadily increasing, but so too is the range of different methods used by fraudsters to commit the fraud. It's almost certain that just about every charity will be targeted at some time. I have written a blog on this subject which can be read by following the link which will be provided, but I thought it would be helpful this afternoon to mention some of the methods of fraud which I have come across, and more importantly, outline what might be done to try to prevent the fraud. The first point that I would want to make is that things are not always what they seem. Never assume that just because a text or a phone call or an email comes from a recognised number or email address that it is genuine. For example, I use internet banking for my personal banking. And whenever I set up a new payee or order a new bank card, the bank will send me a text notifying me of those changes. Hopefully, you'll be able to see the screenshot of the messages which I received from my bank. These all came from the same number and are a useful security check used by the bank to confirm that it is me and not an imposter who is making any changes, or to alert me to any suspicious activity. The first message at the top of the screen asks me to confirm that I have genuinely set up a new payee on my account. The next message, rather worryingly, asks me to check some suspicious activity on my account, and the bottom text advises me that the terms and conditions on my bank account are changing. All of these texts came from the same genuine NatWest phone number, so you might be surprised to learn that the middle text came from a fraudster impersonating NatWest. Had I clicked on that link, the imposter might have gained access to my bank account and passwords. Never assume that just because a text is in the same text chain, that it must be from the same source as the other texts. Incidentally, I have also seen almost identical fraudulent texts appearing to be from a variety of other banks. And it's also relatively easy for a fraudster to impersonate email addresses and phone numbers, so that they too appear to be from a genuine source. So remember, things are not always what they seem. Banks and other institutions are, of course, taking steps to increase security around passwords and other sensitive information. We are all familiar with being asked a security question in addition to the password. And that leads me to my next point: protect your personal information. Typical security questions might be, what is your mother's maiden name? Or what was your first pet? Or what is your favourite holiday destination? The question is, though, how much of that personal information is available from perhaps your Facebook or Instagram account? Do you post pictures of your pet or pictures from your holiday online? Let me tell you a secret: answers to security questions don't have to be genuine. In fact, it might be better to choose a favourite holiday destination that you have never actually visited. You might be surprised at the lengths fraudsters will go to in order to obtain personal details which can be used to help them to then impersonate others. I once came across a situation where a church was having some work done on their building. A fraudster was able to discover the name of the contractor who was carrying out the work, as the name appeared on the hoarding attached to the scaffolding and also on the vans which were parked outside the church while the work was going on. Using this information, the fraudster then phoned the treasurer, whose phone number and name was on the church website, and claimed to be from the contractor. The fraudster then told the treasurer that the bank accounts to which payment should be made had changed, and yes, you can guess what happened next. The treasurer made future payments for the work into the fraudster's bank account. Unfortunately, churches and other charities can be seen as easy targets for fraudsters, as they are often served by volunteers who might be short of time, or they might not have the same controls in place as a commercial organisation might have, for example. So, what steps can be taken to minimise risk? Most of the frauds which I have come across and where internet banking has been used could have been avoided had dual authorisation been in place. I know that not all banks offer this facility on all types of accounts, but many do. Many fraudsters will rely on the fact that people are busy, and the fraudster will always phone or text at an awkward time, maybe early in the morning or at lunchtime, and the treasurer might be caught unawares. Dual authorisation of payments not only builds extra security into the system, but maybe even more importantly, it also delays the payment from being made immediately. It's surprising how frequently a victim of fraud realises almost immediately that they have made a mistake, but often it is already too late to do anything about it. And of course, if your church still use cheques for payments, which I am aware some do, remember never to sign a blank cheque, even where a second signature is required. I know it's tempting, especially if one of the signatories is not going to be at church for the next few weeks when bills will have to be paid. But a better solution is to have enough cheque signatories so that at least two are always available. And be careful about the information that is displayed on church websites, notice boards, or in printed notice sheets. It's probably not a good idea to have the treasurer's name, address, or email address readily available. I remember one church which used to print on their notice sheet everyone who was celebrating a birthday in the coming week. From that, a fraudster obtained the treasurer's date of birth. another useful piece of information which is often used as a security check. If an email is received which is asking for an unexpected payment to be made, it's better to email back to check. But remember, don't reply directly to that particular email. Instead, start a new email chain and always type in the email address rather than copying it from another email. If you receive a phone call from the bank, always say that you will phone back, and when you do, it's best to use a different phone. Never click on a link contained within a text or an email. Remember my text message that I mentioned earlier? Change passwords regularly. Don't use passwords that can be easily guessed, such as your favourite football team or the name of a close relative, and try to use a different password for each website. Use long passwords and use a mixture of numbers, letters, and symbols. Never ever give your password or login details to anyone else, and never leave your laptop or computer unlocked when unattended. It's good practice to have a different password for each of your email accounts and also implement two-step verification. One of our partners has recommended checking out the guidance issued by the National Cyber Security Centre, and the link will be in our follow-up email to this dial-in. Always make sure that you are using the latest version of any software, that there is good antivirus software installed, and that any advice or alerts which have been given by banks, for example, are followed up on. The organisation I mentioned earlier, the National Cyber Security Centre, has also produced a free basic online training course aimed at charities, as well as a number of other resources in this area. Again, there will be links to this information in our follow-up email. Finally, the two most important do's and don'ts. Number one, the bank will never ask you to transfer money from one account to another in order to keep it safe. This is the scenario most commonly used by fraudsters. If your money in the church or charity bank account really is at risk, all banks have more sophisticated methods to safeguard those funds. It will never be necessary for the treasurer to transfer the money to another bank account in order to protect it. And number two of the two most important do's and don'ts, nothing is ever so urgent that it must be done immediately. No matter what the email, text, or phone call says, no matter the circumstances which are described, always take time to think and reflect before acting. Talk to another trustee or office bearer. I was once given very good advice. If you are unsure whether something is the right thing to do, then don't do it. If it turns out to have been the right thing, then you can do it later. If, however, it turned out to be the wrong thing, then it probably cannot be undone after it has been done. So remember, be alert. And with that warning, back to Jackie.
Thank you, Archie. Some excellent points there. Thank you. All those links mentioned by Archie will, of course, be in the follow-up email, so you can take a look at those later. On to the next part of our charity law roundup. So back to Kevin. This time he'll be talking on fundraising appeals and restricted funds. Kevin.
Okay, thanks, Jackie. The basic position is that if a donor specifies, unless a donor specifies otherwise at the point that they make their donation, any funds raised for a specific purpose must be used for that purpose and no other. And that's because legally a trust is created over those funds, which accountants refer to as a restricted fund. But what if the appeal fails? And how can an appeal fail? Well, the law contemplates two types of failure, initial failure and subsequent failure. Let's first consider initial failure. An initial failure occurs where the original purpose of the donations cannot be fulfilled. For example, where after a suitable period of time fundraising, insufficient funds are raised, or a church raises funds for a particular purpose, but before the appeal is complete, the need has been met in another way or by someone else. For an initial failure until now, the funds would be subject to the Charities Failed Appeals Regulations of 2008. And this would normally lead to a lot of administrative effort, advertising, potential involvement of the Charity Commission, and eventual return of the funds raised to the original donors. Thankfully, the 2022 Act repeals these regulations, and they will be replaced by a much simpler process. Now, where any one of four particular circumstances apply, the trustees can simply pass a resolution to use the funds or any parts of the funds raised for what the law calls CPRE purposes. CPRE is actually a Norman French term meaning as near as, so the funds should be used for the next nearest purpose. The four circumstances for which a simple resolution can be passed are, firstly, the charity trustees believe that a donor has given a total of £120 or less, and that excludes gift aid, in the charity's financial year. Second, a donor can't be identified or can't be found after agreed actions have been taken. Now, these agreed actions are those that are agreed between the trustees and the Charity Commission as being reasonable actions taken to identify and find donors. Thirdly, the funds in question are proceeds of cash collections or other means of collecting funds that don't distinguish one gift from another. And the fourth circumstance is an order of the Court or the Charity Commission that directs that it's unreasonable to incur the expense to or unreasonable for donors to expect the return of their donations. And these new rules apply to donations given prior to the passing of the Act as well as subsequently, even if the appeal was launched or failed prior to its commencement, and therefore the effect is retrospective. In terms of the resolution the trustees need to pass, that needs to be passed by a majority of the trustees and states that the purpose to which the funds will be put are reasonably similar to the original purposes for which the funds were raised, and are suitable and effective in the light of current social and economic circumstances. However, if the value of the funds subject to the resolution exceed £1,000, the trustees must send a copy together with their reasons for passing it to the Charity Commission. And in this case, the resolution will not take effect until the Commission consents in writing. If the funds or part of the funds raised don't fall with any of those four circumstances, the trustees must either return the funds to the original donors or seek a CPRE scheme from the Charity Commission. And a scheme is a legal document that the Charity Commission produce if they agree that the purposes of the funds can be used for an amended purpose from the original purpose. Let's look at some examples. First off, a church launches a fundraising appeal seeking donations for a much needed internal refurbishment of their premises. The cost has been quoted at £20,000, and due to their nature, the works will have to be done in whole, not in part. The church raises £10,900 from the appeal, and that comprises two members' donations of £5,000 each and 90 donations of £10, and no one person gave more than £120. In these circumstances, the trustees are able to apply the 90 donations totaling £900 CPRE by simply passing a trustees resolution, and that's because the £10 donations all fall within the first circumstance that I outlined. However, the two donations of £5,000 cannot be applied CPRE by the trustees since they don't fit into any of the four circumstances. So the trustees must either return these donations to the donor or apply to the Charity Commission for a scheme. Let's modify that example a little and say that if instead of raising £10,900, the church raised £11,100, with 110 donations of £10 instead of 90 donations. The funds raised would still be subject to a trustees resolution because they still fit within circumstance 1, but together they amount to more than £1,000. So in this case, the resolution will not take effect unless the Charity Commission has consented in writing to that resolution. So much for initial failure. What is subsequent failure? Subsequent failure occurs where too much has been raised and a surplus remains after the particular purposes of the fundraising appeal have been achieved. And since the original purposes have been fulfilled, funds aren't returnable to the original donors. So if the surplus funds are locked in and can't be applied for the original purposes, then there may be a need to apply them, see prayers above. But here, there's no need to refer to those 4 circumstances at all. All that's needed now is a trustees resolution, and if the funds in question are over £1,000, the consent of the Charity Commission. One final thought. I mentioned at the beginning, where the funds are raised for a specific purpose, they must be used for that purpose because legally a trust is created. So potentially the problem of both initial failure and the subsequent failure can be avoided by the terms of the appeal. If it's possible to effectively appeal for funds, but at the same time say, as part of that appeal, what will happen to the funds if insufficient funds are raised or if too much is raised, there may be no need to go through any of the above processes. Now, that's not always practical, but widening the terms of the appeal in this way should always be considered. And there will be more in the briefing paper that we will send you shortly. Back to you, Jackie.
Thank you, Kevin. That's nice and clear. Appreciated the examples as well. Okay, next, there's been a lot in the news, obviously, at the moment about the cost of living crisis. So Stephen is going to speak to us briefly about the church's response to this very real need in our communities. Over to you, Steve.
Jackie, thank you. I want to cover an increasingly common question we're getting from churches on how we can help people in this crisis. Now, I believe that local churches are extremely well placed to help their communities. They have the call of Christ upon them to love their neighbours, with the added advantage of a lot of personal contact into their communities. Often we think we're too small and limited and don't have the skills. What can we do? So I want to start with the example of the Macedonian churches that Paul talks about in 2 Corinthians, who did not have all the resources they may have wanted. But in the midst of their severe trial, overflowing joy and extreme poverty, they found rich generosity welled up. And as Paul says, they urgently pleaded to share what they had with those in need. Now, this is not just about money. Time and care often has value as least as much as money. And that is what is so often missing in big government responses. And you'll note the Macedonian churches started in relationship, as Paul says. They did not do as we expected, but they gave themselves first to the Lord and then to us in keeping with God's will. However, often finance will be one part of the need and maybe a big part, but it's certainly not about lots of money. Many needs are met with small amounts, but it is about finding the right solution to the need, which is where church is often better placed than large charities or government projects. But we still need to be wise, as gentle as doves and as wise as serpents. Now, help may consist of small money grants, money loans, remembering that they may not come back to you, goods that fill the need, e.g. someone does a week's shopping. Fourthly, advice, where the biggest issue may be budgeting or support with benefits rather than money in itself. Or 5, a combination of the above. Now, I suggest as you think about your approach, you should think about who you'll help and when, what type of help and what sort of information you want from them. What is the process for assessing and of authorising, and what documentation do you expect to hold explaining any expenditure that you're going to make? Now, let's deal with some key thoughts that I have. Firstly, about a person in need. It helps if the person is someone who is known to the church and can be personally vouched for. It's easier to assess what is the right answer and where money is needed, roughly how much. But as we assess things, remember not to add to the shame factor by the style of assessment. Information and applications often best made by a member of the church, preferably someone who knows the person, meeting and seeing them, and then confirmed by leaders in a quick, effective process proportionate to the amounts being given. If you're given small amounts, like under £200, you want a light touch approach, a quick yes, or yes but, or not at this time and with a reason. If it's over £1,000, then you will want more information, documentation, an explanation of why or why not you're giving or lending money. Some churches have a general policy of support only for those who are in the church, prioritizing the Lord's household. Other churches will go wider into their communities, thinking of Jesus' parable of the sheep and the goats. I really do recommend that you think through your own policy and when and why you provide support. And if it is only to those who are in the church, then why is that? Since you are a public charity and the funds you give out are not just about friendship, but about relief of poverty or hardship. Without such a policy, it may be difficult to explain the charitable logic of what you're doing to local media or others who may ask. Secondly, think about timing. Often crises are pretty immediate or are foreseeable only in the next few days, so have a system that's able to respond quickly. However, you may see a longer term need which may be best helped not just with money, but with practical advice and a loose commitment to further support if needed. If this is the case, normally I'd suggest meeting the immediate perceived need as well as meeting the person to talk about the wider, longer term aspects. Thirdly, amounts of finance. Small, and if appropriate, ongoing payments I would normally prefer to large one-off gifts. This helps speed and flexibility and ongoing assessment of the situation. Once you've given money, you can't ever get it back, really. If the need is larger than £200 to £250, it's often worth aiming to give advice on budgeting, probably through a local CAP or money advice centre. If it is to a member of the church that's needing help, then the personal aspects of emotional support from the church community should not be underestimated. The sense of having others on your side is so very important. But I think this is also true for those outside the church family. One example, when I was in a church in London, when crisis hit an individual, the combination of small amounts of financial help plus personal interaction, people just being there, was more valuable than anything else. I'd also advise don't overpromise. I think it's unwise to suggest the church is an endless source of funds for anyone. It's better to explain that there are limited funds available. If necessary, that's coming from church members who care for the community, and therefore we're limited to the amount that's available and have to support the most needy. Also remember, CAP and Money Community Advice Centres are a useful step towards any further help that's thought possible. So people are learning to budget and deal with debt, as well as just having your help. So in the midst of widespread shortage and need, let's remember the examples of Christians many centuries ago. In the Roman times, one of the factors that impacted the empire was the realization that in famine and plague, the Christian church was helping communities more effectively than the official administration. In the 4th century, the Emperor Julian, who was very keen to ensure the empire remained pagan, noted, quote, "The impious Christians, in addition to their own, support ours, and it is shameful that our poor should be lacking our aid." It demonstrated Christianity was not just a belief, but a change in life and heart. Now I want to move to a second aspect of looking after people in this cost of living crisis. This is about looking after our own workers who themselves care for the flock, but often we unintentionally forget their own needs. As we look after others, we need to make sure our workers who are doing that are themselves looked after. So I want to outline a number of key points, starting with volunteers. Now, you can't pay or make gifts to those who volunteer because they're volunteering. If you do, you risk changing their volunteer status to that of paid workers, which has massively dangerous implications. So do not make love gifts or pay extra allowances. You can, however, make sure that they know they can and should reclaim all expenses that they incur because they're volunteering. Historically, many church volunteers don't claim, and they're not encouraged to. If they really don't need the money, then they can always give it back to the church, but make sure they know they can and should claim and make it easy for them. Secondly, on staff, do review salaries. Staff salaries should be subject to a regular review process. In days of 2 to 3% inflation, it may not have been critical if this wasn't thought about. With inflation around 10% and maybe much more, it certainly is. So have a small team who know it's their responsibility to do this. Consider carefully what changes need to be made and when. Now, I'm old enough to remember inflation at 25%. And as an employer, salaries having to be reviewed more than once a year. We may get back to that. Thirdly, don't just use CPI or RPI inflation. Bear in mind what sort of increase the church members are likely to be getting themselves. In some sectors, this may be only 1 or 2%, or even none. And in others, it may be more than inflation. This has a massive psychological impact on the workers and the members funding them if there's a complete out of sync difference between what workers are being paid and what the members themselves are having to face. Also, remember debt. It's a hidden and taboo subject in church. Many church leaders and workers have troubling levels of debt and are ashamed to talk to anybody about it. Make sure this is an open subject for your workers. Make sure it's raised with them, not as a question, do you have debt? But they know that if they do and it is troubling them, they have someone to go to confidentially in the church or outside of the church so they can talk privately. I hope that's helpful. Thank you. Back to you, Jackie.
Thank you, Stephen. That was very helpful. Really appreciate that. I'm going to move quickly on to our final slot for today, which is the Charity Law Roundup. And this time, Kevin is going to talk to us about ex-gratia payments. Kevin.
Thank you, Jackie. Before going further, I want to emphasise that I'm not expecting any change to the substance of the new ex-gratia rules, but last weekend the government announced that they wish to reconsider these provisions and that consequently there will be a delay in their implementation. Now, my understanding from talking with the relevant officials is that this delay relates to unexpected interactions of the new rules with existing laws surrounding museum collections. So my expectation is that any amendments to the Act will be very specific to them. But as I say, the new rules will not be implemented alongside trustee remuneration and fundraising appeals. There may be a short delay, it may be longer, but we'll still run through the changes with you now. The first change made by the 2022 Act is to introduce an objective test of what is meant by an ex-gratia payment, and by implication, what is not. And we'll spend a few minutes considering that in a little more detail. The new test is on screen for you there. The most important points to note are those last 2 bullet points. That an ex-gratia payment is one that strictly the trustees cannot legally make, because they have no power to do so, but can reasonably be regarded as under a moral obligation to do so. And one area that causes a lot of confusion here is what you might call an out-of-court settlement of a legal claim, for example, a compromise payment in an employment or legacy dispute. Where a legal claim is being defended, the trustees do have power to make such a payment, provided that it is in the best interest of their charity to do so. For example, to reach acceptable legal terms and avoid protracted legal costs. Therefore, a payment of this nature will not be an ex-gratia payment. Another point to note is that ex-gratia payments should be rare. According to past court decisions, the law assumes that ex-gratia payments will be, quote, rare and sporadic, and only permitted in limited circumstances. So what the Act envisages is an enabling power, not an obligation. Even if there is a moral obligation, there is no legal obligation and no automatic expectation that a payment will be made. Let's look at some examples. Alf's will provides for the remaining estate after specific legacies to be paid to Save the Unicorn, a registered charity. Following Alf's passing, his relatives claim that he executed a later will in which each relative is given a share of the remaining estate alongside the charity. However, the legal validity of the replacement will is being challenged, and on the limited evidence, the issue can only be definitively settled by the court. Save the Unicorn decides that in order to avoid expensive litigation and following legal advice received, they will make a compromise payment to each of the relatives mentioned in the contested will. Now, this will not be an ex gratia payment, as the trustees have power to act in the charity's best interest to settle the legal claim against them. And this is so even if the charity is motivated by a sense of moral obligation. Let's look at Chris's will. She leaves the remainder of her estate to the church. Shortly before her death, she instructs solicitors to change her will so as to include an additional legacy to a relative with significant financial needs. Sadly, Chris dies before the change is legally completed. The church recognises the moral obligation to support the relative in the way that Chris had clearly indicated. They therefore make a payment equal to the legacy the relative would have received if the amendment had been carried through. In this case, this is an ex gratia payment. The relative had no strict legal rights as the changed will never came into existence, meaning that there's no legal power or obligation on the part of the church to make payment. Let's look at another example. A church wishes to give its long-serving retired pastor a pension in excess of that to which he or she is contractually entitled. Here, there is no legal obligation on the charity and no power to make payment. However, the trustees, recognising long service and realising that the pension provision is, taking account of all the circumstances, inadequate, they feel a moral obligation to help as best they can. This would fall within the definition of an ex gratia payment, although because of the size of the payment and the circumstances of it, the Charity Commission are likely to require consent to be given. So the first change is the introduction of the objective test. Let's move on to consider the second change that the Act makes, governing when Charity Commission consent for a payment is required. Until now, Charity Commission consent was required for all but the smallest of payments. This is now relaxed by the introduction of a sliding scale with financial thresholds based on the charity's income. So for the smallest charities, an ex gratia payment of up to £1,000 can be made without the need for consent, and this rises up to £20,000 for the largest charities. The exact thresholds are on the screen there for you. There are three key points that I want to make on this. The first is that the new statutory power may be restricted. Sorry, can we go back to the previous slide? The new statutory power may be restricted or excluded by the terms of the charity's governing document. Let's go forward again on the slide. Second, the statutory threshold applies per financial year of the charity. Finally, it applies per payment and is not the aggregate of all ex gratia payments in the year. But do bear in mind that the court's previous determination that ex gratia payments should be rare and sporadic and only permitted in limited circumstances. So there you are, you're up to speed on the main changes coming in from Charities Act 2022 at this time, with the exception of ex gratia payments, which we hope will come in soon, and we'll cover more detail of later changes in later dial-ins. Back to you, Jackie.
Thank you, Kevin. I'm going to whip through now to question time, but before we do, we have a very recent update from the Charity Commission, I'm just going to hand over to Stephen very briefly to update you, Stephen.
Okay, yeah. I was in a meeting yesterday with the Charity Commission, and when they heard we were having this dial-in today, they asked if we would communicate some things that they would really like to get across to the faith sector. There were 3 things that they see that the sector is not doing too well on, and they see as important priorities. Here are those 3 things. Firstly, accounts and annual returns being submitted on time. They commented the faith sector has a greater problem in this issue than most other sectors. In fact, I think that in reality, any other sector. For the Commission, it is a sign that governance is weak. And then they ask themselves, what other areas are therefore also weak in governance? So get your accounts and annual returns in on time. Secondly, internal financial controls. It seemed to them that the faith sector didn't see the importance of these, that trust and relationship seemed to reduce the realization of the real risks that poor financial controls have. And sadly, I'd personally totally agree with them. And Archie, having just said what he said earlier on, would too. Thirdly, the independent inquiry on child sex abuse. This is the 5-year national inquiry into the decades of child sex abuse in Britain, and it delivers its conclusions today. In fact, it came out about an hour ago, I believe. ICSA, what is known as, is one of the largest and most expensive investigations of its kind ever undertaken in Britain, set up in July 2014 or 15, I think, following a series of revelations of abuse. You remember the Jimmy Savile stuff, but also many in churches and faith groups of all types. Whilst this is a subject that churches have had a lot of focus on in the recent past, the Commission want trustees to realise that they, that's the Commission, consider safeguarding to be a top priority for all charities, with only a very few exceptions. Not just have policies in place, but also regular focus on the training and implementation, i.e., is this working in our charity? So, please do have your trustees read that report and look at things afresh in the light of it. Those are the things that they wanted to get across, and I hope I've managed that for them. Thanks.
Thank you, Stephen. That was very good timing. Pretty much out of time. So we're going to stop here. If you have had a question we didn't get to, then just please check out the resources that we send in the follow-up email. And we did have someone ask if we can send out Stephen's 3 points from the Charity Commission, and we will endeavour to pop those in to the follow-up email as well. So you have those 3 points as well. We didn't have time to put a slide together for that. Also included in that follow-up email will be a survey. I know you have loads of them, but it should take no more than 3 minutes. Everyone wants your feedback, but we'd be really grateful if you could spare a bit of time just to let us know what we're doing well, and if there is anything else that you'd like us to include in these lunchtime dial-ins. This particularly if you haven't taken part in a survey for a while, we'd love to hear from you. Thank you. Our next dial-in for your date for your diary is on the 23rd of February 2023, and so do keep it free. We really hope that you'll be able to join us, and please feel free to invite anyone else you know who may be interested. And we're keen to address the issues that directly concern you in your role, so if there is anything you'd like us to cover, just let us know in that survey and we will do our best to address that. And now it just remains for me to say thank you to our panelists, to Stephen and Kevin and Archie, for taking the time to share their expertise and answering your questions. And thank you to you all for joining us today. We hope you found it helpful. And we pray that you and your organisations will be a blessing to those you serve over the coming months. And we will look forward to seeing you again in the new year. Thank you for joining us.